Peace, friends. I'm Pastor Tom Arthur from Sycamore Creek in Lansing, Michigan, and we've been putting this challenge to our church this fall. Read the New Testament in 10 weeks. It's a great challenge anytime, but especially during a pandemic. Dive into these ancient books that still speak today about who Jesus is and what his life, his teaching, his death, and resurrection have to do with our lives today. Each week during the challenge, I'm interviewing a different New Testament scholar, and today you get to hear an interview that I had with Dr. Frilingos. He's the professor in the Department of Religious Studies at our very own Michigan State University, where he teaches classes on the introduction to biblical literature, Christianity, and the birth of Christianity. Dr. Frilingos is the author most recently of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, Family Trouble in the Infancy Gospels. But more pertinent to our conversation today, he's the author of Spectacles of Empire, Monsters, Martyrs, and the Book of Revelation. We're certainly in an apocalyptic revelation kind of year, and I think you'll find my interview with Dr. Frilingos really fascinating. So here it is. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being with us today. Before we get to talking about the book of Revelation, give us an inside view on what it's been like to be an MSU professor during the pandemic. And we're sitting here right on the beginning of this 3-week pause. So it seems like we're going back into it. What's it been like for you?
Yeah, that's right. Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy to talk about some of these topics. So this semester has been a little bit like my very first year of teaching. I've done both of my courses are taught asynchronously. So we had the option, we had a number of options we could choose from, and it made the most sense for my family as well as for me to try to do it asynchronously. So I work very, very hard each week because I'm building structure each week for students to explore a lot of the material on their own. Mm-hmm. So I record a lecture, but I'm not convinced that's really where the learning's happening. So I create study guides and quizzes and discussion post assignments. So they're engaging with the material in a way that mimics, but doesn't really reproduce the classroom setting.
So it seems like once you build that whole system, you're not going to ever have to teach again.
Oh, right. Well, that's the promise, right? And then I can just sit back and, listen to music.
You can just read and grade papers.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the grading demands have gone up. And I think that's what this format requires. So a lot of the teaching is happening through these kind of graded assignments. But at the university, we're supposed to approach our job holistically. So teaching is just one component of what we do, and it's supposed to be about 40% of our work effort. Mm-hmm. And this semester, it's totally imbalanced. So research is supposed to be 40, teaching is 40, and then another 20% dedicated to service in the university. And teaching has really kind of swallowed up all of my time.
Sure.
Which is not a complaint, it's a reality. And I think it's been a challenge for a lot of the faculty. And I think it's probably been a greater challenge for the students. Mm-hmm. If I could just go on with this for just a little bit longer. Yeah. So students who were accustomed to kind of coming into a classroom, twice a week for an hour and a half, and then maybe dedicating 3 additional hours per class for reading outside, doing work outside of the classroom. I mean, now what they're doing is they're online from like 8 in the morning until 8 at night, and lucky to get off by then. And that's because they're kind of part of the learning curve with faculty. We're trying to figure it out. And I think some of us have gone overboard And I think it's been a real challenge for all of the parties kind of involved in learning. But that's just my observation. So
I wonder if there have been any academic practices or things that you've been reading during the pandemic that have been helpful to you personally.
Yes, very much. Getting off the screen. That's the big thing. I do yoga regularly. That helps, I find, to kind of clear my mind. But I also listen to a lot of books and through audiobooks. That's something I would highly recommend. People who want to read, but their eyes are just exhausted, listen to something. And I love listening to fiction, but academic books as well. It's a really good way, I think, to kind of engage with thoughtful stuff and at the same time to get some of your other senses involved.
Yeah. I last weekend, my 2 weeks ago, my 98-year-old grandma passed away. And
I'm sorry.
She lived in Indianapolis. And when you're a pastor, you also end up being the pastor to your family. So they of course reached out to me to lead the funeral. And I haven't traveled anywhere in the car for much of anything, but I had basically an eight hours in the car on this past Saturday. And the blessing of it was getting to listen to audiobooks for 8 hours.
It can be very absorbing, right? So is it just a diverse group of books you listen to? Do you prefer to listen to fiction or nonfiction? How does it work for you?
Well, I had about 4 or 5 books that I was bouncing around just to keep. I feel like I need a little bit of variety to stay focused while I'm driving. But some fiction, some nonfiction, and some kind of, I guess, self-helpy and some academic, kind of a mixture of the whole thing. And I listened to a chapter or 2 of one and then bounce to another one. I didn't think about that until I got in the middle of it. And I'm like, when did I give myself 8 hours during the pandemic to just listen to audiobooks?
No, that's right. That's right. I've found a whole new kind of way of being in the world through audiobooks. That's what I find.
So as we kind of turn the corner to the New Testament, you're a New Testament scholar with a focus on Revelation, but I wonder if you have some tips that you give your students or you give the people listening to us now about reading the New Testament in general.
Yeah, so the tips would reflect the way I structure a syllabus. So, when I'm thinking about the reading demands for the semester, students are not just reading biblical literature in a course in biblical literature. They're also reading scholarship, which can be pretty demanding. So I'm trying to balance these things. But I always try to err on having students read more from the primary sources if they can. What I've found over my years of teaching is that many of my students come into my classroom feeling that they've known the Bible all their lives, but they've mostly engaged with it in bits and pieces, kind of atomistically. A verse here, a verse there, and I think that in religious practice there's a time and place for that. But what I would say is that the Gospel of Mark was written to be read as the entire Gospel of Mark, and if you can find some time to read it from front to back, I think you have a different kind of experience doing that. So that's what I would recommend. See if you can find some time to just take on an entire biblical book. So right, yeah.
That's what we're doing. This is the New Testament challenge. So cha-ching for us.
Yes, right.
Bonus points in your class because people are reading the New Testament in its entirety over 10.
Yes, that's tremendous. I think it's a tremendous gift for people to have the space to do that and to be held accountable for it. So that's good.
My wife is creating videos called the New Testament Challenge for Losers, for people who are not keeping up with their reading pace. But
Okay, well, maybe not so much judgment, but
in my well, she's not keeping up with it either. That's the whole
oh,
thing.
okay.
It's a funny thing, because she's not well. But I have a group of ladies who are all retired in my reading group, and they're all keeping up with it, and they're listening to the scholar interviews, and they have more time.
Yes, good.
But so you've focused on Revelation, and maybe there's a way that you would describe your specialty. How would you describe that, and how did you end up picking that specialty as a scholar?
Yeah. That's a good question. So I would actually describe myself as a historian of early Christianity, more than anything else. So I regularly teach an Introduction to Biblical Literature course, and as part of that course, we deal with New Testament writings, but we also look at the Jewish scriptures in the order and according to the canon that most Jews regard it as sacred. So the Tanakh is the term that applies there. So I've always been interested in biblical literature, but my research, my training has been more broadly in the history and the development of Christianity as a religion in, say, the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. So it was in that context that I started to write about the book of Revelation for my dissertation. And that's what eventually became my first book. And I wanted to try to understand Revelation within its broader cultural context in the Roman Empire. So in my classes and in my research, I'm regularly engaging with broader historical and literary questions that often use New Testament writings as kind of important pieces of evidence or case studies, but hopefully contribute to this larger conversation about Christianity in the Roman world.
Yeah. This is an interesting interview to have with you, because everyone else I've interviewed has been a professor or scholar, generally in a seminary, training pastors or church leaders. And I reached out to you in part because MSU is right in our backyard.
Right.
And it feels like there's a lot of resources there that we wouldn't want to ignore. But I'm curious, why would a major state university care to have its students study a book like the Book of Revelation? Or you might say, why is studying the Book of Revelation without any particular religious commitments an important endeavor or one of value?
Yeah. That's another very good question. So, my sense of this is that the Department of Religious Studies, which I teach in, is part of the university because MSU sees it as part of the mission of the university to create good citizens. And that means having an understanding of the humanities, and the study of religion fits within the humanities. So I think it would be there's dedication to the critical study of religion, probably not to, say, Christian exegesis of the Book of Revelation. So it would be strange for me to offer a course on just the Book of Revelation. What I do is offer a course instead on Jewish and Christian apocalypticism. And Revelation fits as a kind of a case study within that. Mm-hmm. So like my colleagues, I see myself as a historian of religion, or as a scholar of religion, and we offer courses that dig into, kind of the general themes of different religions, but also specific topics.
Yeah.
And I think in a multicultural society, it really is the obligation of state universities to expose their students to the study of the study of religion. Now, we don't have a distribution requirement in our university. So not everybody who comes to MSU ends up in one of our courses. I wish they did, because my colleagues are great. They're great teachers, great scholars. But most MSU students find themselves at some point in a humanities course. And more courses in the humanities are integrating the study of religion into what they're doing.
Yeah. So you already kind of hinted at this as apocalyptic literature, and
Yes.
Revelation as an example of that, or a case study. What is apocalyptic literature? What's an apocalypse? What's ancient apocalypse? Let's sort of start to turn the corner to Revelation specifically now.
All right. Yeah. So I think that the historical framework for understanding a book like Revelation is something called apocalypticism. Both the term apocalypse and apocalypticism come ultimately from a Greek word, apocalypsis, which means revelation, or better, unveiling. And the basic idea of apocalypticism is that there is a tension between the way things are and the way they ought to be. And historically, the development of thinking around this tension can be located in early forms of Judaism. And an example of kind of apocalyptic thinking found today in both the Jewish and Christian Bibles is the book of Daniel. So at least part of the book of Daniel is what we would call an apocalypse. And it expresses a kind of worldview, a way of thinking about the world that gets at this tension between the way things are and the way they ought to be. So apocalypticism says that the universe is dualistic. There is a struggle between good and evil going on, a transcendent reality that's deeper than the things that ordinary human beings experience. So there are angels and devils. The righteous people of God are gathered under the God of Israel. Is wielding come out of apocalypticism. Apocalypticism is pretty pessimistic about the way things are. So things aren't getting better, they're going to get worse. But the good news is there will be vindication for the righteous people of God. So the righteous might suffer in the present, but ultimately God will intervene. And in what's usually cast as a kind of judgment day, God will separate the righteous from the wicked, and the wicked will be punished and the righteous will be restored. And finally, apocalypticism has taught for centuries that all of this stuff was going to happen right away. So there's a very imminent sense of the winding down of things. So what I usually tell my students is that apocalypticists see this cataclysm happening not 2,000 years in the future, but like next Wednesday. And despite what scholars of religion sometimes describe as the disappointment of these apocalyptic visions not coming true imminently, apocalyptic ideas persist. So I can pause there. I'd like to talk a little bit about apocalypses as a kind of writing that expresses this worldview.
Yeah,
but if what I said was clear, that's fine. But if not, yeah.
What I'm hearing you describe, it's almost, you go into an ancient Barnes and Noble, and there's kind of a section of the store called apocalyptic literature, and that Revelation has features that are similar to the other books in that section.
That's right. That's a good way of summarizing it. The apocalyptic worldview was widespread the best we can tell, among ancient Jews, and eventually became really part of the DNA of early Christianity.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the writings from both Jews and Christians that we know about during the period, say 200 before zero and 200 after zero, express apocalyptic ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So the book of Revelation, you're right, would be like on a shelf with other apocalypses, but it would also be part of a broader section of books that express apocalyptic ideas but aren't apocalypses. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have writings that are similar to the book of Revelation, but a lot that aren't, nevertheless, all predict a coming day of judgment. So an apocalypse, and the book of Revelation is an example of that, is a kind of writing. And the book of Daniel, the book of Revelation are the best known examples of apocalypses because they belong to biblical canons. Mm-hmm. For Jews on the one hand, and then for Christians as well. But there are many other examples from the ancient world that did not make their way into biblical canons. So just to throw out some names, Apocalypse of Peter, Apocalypse of Adam, 4 Ezra, 2nd Baruch, 1st Enoch. All of these are writings that survive from the ancient world. We have manuscripts of them. Many of them have been translated into English, but most Jews and Christians today aren't familiar with them because they're not part of the biblical canon.
Yeah. You got to go to a religion department to read and study those.
Well, that's...
Or be even familiar with them.
Read the examples.
So I'm not quite sure if this is where you were going, but let me sort of tee you up here in this respect. I think one of the expectations of early Christians was, and that's always talked about with the book of Revelation, is a second coming of Jesus, second coming of Christ, and a judgment day. So why this set of expectations?
Yes, that's very good. So that ties into what I was saying earlier. So Christianity, the best we can tell, did not really emerge as a kind of separate religion until decades after the crucifixion of Jesus. Jesus's first followers were all Jews, and the movement that sprang up after the death of Jesus and believed that he had been raised from the dead, well, that movement was also Jewish. Most of these people, including Jesus himself, I think, and many other scholars think, were shaped by apocalyptic expectations. And so the view that a day of judgment was at hand, that God would send a Messiah to rally the faithful, and in some sources even lead an army against the armies of Satan. This view was alive and well, and I think that this is what works its way into Christianity. So the earliest writings of the New Testament, I mean, I'm sure your viewers are all aware of this, but the letters of Paul are just shot through with apocalyptic expectations. Paul talks in 1 Corinthians about the present form of this world passing away. He seems to expect that the end is near, but he knows that the figure that he believes is the Messiah, Jesus, was crucified and raised from the dead. So how is God going to inaugurate this end time? Paul, like others in this early stage, believed that it would involve a return, a second coming of the Messiah. And in this second coming, Jesus would come in power this time, not as a figure who suffers and dies. And through through this expectation, Christians eventually began to create a kind of understanding about themselves and the world that is fully expressed, I think, really in the book of Revelation. And it's there in that book that the expectation of a judgment day is spoken of explicitly. The destruction of the earth is described, and the arrival of a new heaven and new earth is narrated. So the seeds are there in the letters of Paul and kind of full flower in the book of Revelation.
Sure. I think that most Christians or lay readers or people who are familiar with Revelation assume that it was written during a time of persecution. So tell us a little bit about the research. The scholarly research puts it at a different time period. So fill us in on when was Revelation written.
Yes. Okay. So traditionally, Revelation was thought to have been written during the reign of Nero. So in the early 60s, so about 30 years or so after the death of Jesus. And Nero, there are stories about Nero blaming the Great Fire of Rome on Christians because they were an easy target. And that Revelation was kind of written in response to that moment of persecution, and even perhaps identifies Nero as one of the beasts of Revelation, one of these figures of evil. I would say the trend is away from that identification among scholars today. Most scholars, I think, see Revelation as a multi-draft work. So parts of it may have been written as early as Nero and may be responding to that in part, but the final form of it, the kind of final redaction of it, didn't happen until around the year 100, maybe a few years before then. And so questions about persecution have become a little bit more complicated. Even if we were to locate it in Nero's day, the persecution of Christians under Nero was very localized and less about their identity as Christians and more as a way of just kind of scapegoating an unpopular group. We don't have an awful lot of direct evidence for Roman empire-wide persecution of Christians until the middle of the 3rd century, around the year 250. So whatever inspired the book of Revelation, and I think it's more along the lines that this view of the world was just part of the DNA of Christianity from the beginning. I don't think it was direct persecution. Now, I'm going to qualify that for here quickly, because the writer of Revelation talks about being on an island, the island of Patmos, because of his witness. So scholars really have poured over that claim. And there are a number of different ways of interpreting it. One would be he was exiled to an island because of his Christianity. Other scholars have suggested that John went to the island in order to try to evangelize. So that he wasn't fleeing from persecution. He was actually trying to recruit followers to Christianity. And this is why he went to the island. I'm not sure myself, but there are different ways of reading it.
Sure.
So right. Yeah.
So if Revelation isn't written during a time of persecution, then it kind of begs the question, what was the author trying to accomplish? And you sent me an article which brought me back to seminary of reading kind of the survey of there's sort of scholarly camps in answering this question. So give us a lay of that land of scholarly camps, and then where do you fit in that?
Yes.
In your own scholarship or where you've drawn conclusions?
Yeah, so I would say that today there remains a kind of debate over John's view of the Roman Empire, and that this is the kind of motivating factor. So if it's not in a direct experience of persecution, John is still responding to feelings of oppression, maybe perceived oppression, rather than actual oppression, and that the book of Revelation is somehow an expression of these feelings. So I would say that you've got some scholars who see the book of Revelation as kind of an articulation of resistance to the Roman Empire, and that the symbols are meant to convey that resistance. So John is trying to persuade other Christians that they need to take a strong stance against the Roman Empire, somehow, because the empire itself is not really what you see. It's actually being manipulated behind the scenes by figures of darkness. Then there are other scholars who see John as interested less in the Roman Empire and more in kind of defining himself against rival Christian preachers in his day, or rival Christian prophets, to use his own language, who have their own definitions of Christianity. And John is trying to kind of hype up his own followers and recruit new followers to a more radical apocalyptic view of Christianity. So those are probably the two largest camps. There is a growing number of scholars who fit somewhere in between. I think I'm probably there too, who see Revelation as expressing a kind of cultural engagement. So not really taking a political stance against the Roman Empire, but also not only interested in arguing for one form of Christianity over another, but more kind of engaging with the cultural currents of his day, and trying to understand how Christianity fits into this larger picture. So even as he's kind of railing against the empire, John is trying to make some space for his interpretation of Christianity in the empire. That's a little long-winded and convoluted, but that's more where I might see myself and some other scholars.
So when I was reading the article that you gave me, and one thing that I was thinking about kind of in that respect was, in some ways, the way that that our church or many churches take kind of cultural expressions or forms and use them to try to make a point, I guess. You might say, like, we occasionally will do like a series that's like God at the movies, and you try to take a movie and pick out some kind of spiritual wisdom or parallels in the movie. But then what ends up happening at times is sometimes the form of the movie overshadows the content that you're trying to deliver, and it ends up delivering the opposite message because of the kind of movie that you picked. And it feels like that's always like a challenge anytime you borrow a symbol or form from culture that's really strong and potent. Would you say that that's kind of a similar thing that's happening with Revelation? He's borrowing this cultural form of apocalypticism and all of the everything in Roman imperial language and imperial force and armies and pulling that in to make a point.
I think that's a great analogy, actually. I might use that myself, if that's all right.
Yeah, please do.
So as a historian, what I can say is that whatever John's original intention was, there's no way that he could have predicted how Revelation would be received, even just 40 years after its writing. So we know about a group called the Montanists, a pretty popular, vibrant form of Christianity in the 2nd century. in basically the neighborhood of the world in which John himself lived, who believed that the New Jerusalem that Revelation predicted was going to descend in the town in which the Montanists set up shop, and believed that all other forms of Christianity were inadequate because they didn't properly understand that this is exactly what John was predicting. That would not become the dominant interpretation of the book of Revelation. It would be a little bit like saying, I don't care what you say, that New Jerusalem is going to land in Lansing in 2025. I mean, that's essentially what was happening. So I do think that the form of Revelation, the rhetoric of Revelation, the imagery, that does, I think, tap into both traditions from Jewish apocalypses, as well as cultural forms like Roman spectacles, is the overwhelming impression that people get from the book of Revelation. That it is a book of images, and it is meant to evoke all kinds of terrifying and wonderful visions before your eyes. And I feel like maybe whatever message is there, which I think is open to interpretation, gets lost in it. That what we're encountering in the book of Revelation is an extraordinary mind who is able to summon up an astonishing range of characters, and to give each of these characters a kind of life that maybe gets away from him, from John, that is. I mean, the beast of Revelation, the multiple beasts, are as fully realized in the book as the good characters, I would say. So that kind of reminds me of astonishing thing. Yeah.
Reminds me of the critique of Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings, that the Mordor was more compelling than Gondor. It was easier to take like the evil side of Middle Earth, gruesome,
maybe so.
More so than the light side, so to speak.
Yeah, I think there's something to that.
Well, maybe that rings true to me in a lot of ways, in the sense that it does feel like it's a potential error that interpreters or pastors or readers of Revelation get into, or they get in and they get sucked into the power of the imagery.
Yes.
And picking that all apart. I mean, Christians are well known for trying to map all of those images and symbols onto modern day events. Like you said, it's happening next Wednesday. This politician is this person, and this country is this person, and then miss something in the midst of all of that imagery.
Yes.
Chris, I'm really grateful for the time you've spent with us.
Oh, my pleasure.
And sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And I want to be respectful of the time that you've given us.
Thank you.
We do wish you well in your academic endeavors during this strange and unique, can we call it apocalyptic year?
I don't know what else to call it. This has been a year. So.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Friends, you've been listening to the last of our weekly New Testament Challenge Scholar interviews with Dr. Chris Frilingos, professor in the Department of Religious Studies at our very own Michigan State University. You can find out more about Dr. Frilingos on his faculty page at msu.edu. During this fall, our church is taking a challenge. Read the New Testament in 10 weeks. We're diving into these ancient books about the life, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and learning how following Jesus will change your life today. You don't have to do this challenge alone. We've been putting out daily brief thought videos, weekly one-page readings with reflection questions, and small groups to do it all together. Find out about all of these resources on our Facebook and YouTube pages. and connect with us more deeply by filling out our digital connection card at sycamorecreekchurch.org/connect. We hope you'll consider joining us again in the future. Until then, read your New Testament and peace out.